By 7 a.m., or I'm sorry, audiobook, part 7 and part 8. Part 7. By 7 a.m., on day 1 of the invasion, some merely 7 hours in, it was time to move again. Leapfrogging past the battalions currently finishing off American forces at the Fort Meade battle, still raging by this point, Private Lee Chang's battalion of mechanized infantry had since moved some 8 miles south on I-95, just prior to turning off onto a local road, moving into the junction with I-395, currently providing security for the Air Defense Artillery Battalion of the whole of 92nd Infantry Division, of which Lee's Mechanized Infantry Battalion was also a part. The men sat, eating MREs and smoking cigarettes, for about an hour, discussing their first combat encounters of the campaign up to that point. The headquarters company had moved due east another 5 miles to collect fuel from the 31st Group Army's headquarters battalion, which set up its headquarters on a CCP regime farm to direct the massive operation to capture the enemy's capital city. The farm was, for its part, a huge logistical depot, and even housed the 31st Group Army's 31st Signals Regiment, who was an electronic warfare and communications unit for the entire 31st Group Army. The 31st Signals Regiment and Headquarters Battalion of the whole 31st Group Army were often attached to one another for simplicity's sake, due to the level of coordination between the two requiring such measures. 2 hours later, at 9 a.m., it was already time to prepare to move again. This, as the freshly filled fuel truck of the company's headquarters platoon of Lee's company within their mechanized infantry battalion moved down the line of vehicles to fill them, topping off all their fuel to where they would be ready for the next part of the operation, entering the Cap City's outer suburbs themselves. By the time the vehicles were all filled up, and ammo, food, and water were also replenished in each vehicle, and mechanics even checked all vehicles for any mission-hindering deficiencies, Private Quing spoke into the headset to Private Lee, who still sat as the gunner of the vehicle. With Quing as the driver of the APC, the Armor Personnel Carrier, the rest of the troops sat in the troop cab, ready as dismounts at a moment's notice. "You ready to make history?" Quing's jovial-sounding voice had snapped. "I'm ready, and I hope we all make it home alive, too," responded Private Lee, cautiously, and without saying how he truly felt about it, which could have been misconstrued by the squad's sergeant or anyone else perhaps listening into the headset at that given moment. "Yeah, I think it'll all be the adventure of a lifetime," Quing retorted. "Private Quing, let's roll out, now!" snapped the sergeant over the intercom. "Roger, Sergeant," answered Quing, as the vehicle jolted forward into action. "Private Lee, look alive up there. Remember, our enemy citizenry has access to small arms, and we already seen that one get stupid ideas that they think that they can go up against a grouping of our armored vehicles. So apparently, that won't deter all of them," said the sergeant over the intercom, matter-of-factly. "Yes, Sergeant," answered Lee in the affirmative to the statement, even as the whole battalion was on the move, being accompanied by the Air Defense Artillery Battalion in the 92nd Infantry Division. The sounds of rockets and shells and airdropped and launched munitions could all be heard reverberating as they all impacted across the region, blasting so loudly upon impact that they all could be heard over the rumblings of even all of the hundreds of vehicles all moving on the road of both battalions, Lee's Mechanized Infantry Battalion and the Air Defense Artillery Battalion. Only a few miles just south of where they'd turned onto the highway, the Battle of Andrews was now wrapping up, as the air installation was now being rapidly secured. Since the flanks were nearly secured on all routes of advance into the city, the command staff and general over the whole 31st Group Army and the whole operation as a whole, including the foreign allies involved, had deemed it time to begin sending forces into the outermost suburbs of the Cap City itself. Meanwhile, the men remaining still alive of the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade, the American forces on Fort Meade, were trying to fight the good fight, now in a fighting retreat, although finding nowhere to go, as Chi-Com forces had since closed in to conduct mop-up operations in the immediate area, where just several hours ago a major battle had occurred. Finally, having had found new rifles to replace those lost in the destroyed battalion headquarters building when the Chi-Com artillery barrage had came in, which eliminated or wounded, some even mortally, many, including Lieutenant Colonel Larson, who had been wiped out by shrapnel flying through an LMTV, or a covered truck, which sat in front of the entranceway at the time of the barrage. Sergeant Richardson, the former driver of Lieutenant Colonel Larson, and PFC Jeffers, who was the man whom Richardson had found inside the dilapidated structure after the barrage, were now on the move, bounding with a group of surviving forces from rubble pile to rubble pile, cover and concealment position to cover and concealment position. They were merely only one of many such groups of mixed forces who lacked any sort of coherent coordination or strategy. This due as much to there being no communications or actionable intel on the situation as it was to the chaos and complete destruction caused by the artillery barrage and precision airstrikes, which added to the pandemonium by decapitating the command structure of many of the units. Upon the elimination of key leadership structures and command and control centers on the installation, the battalion headquarters building of Lieutenant Colonel Larson's battalion being only one of many such structures, came the rattling of their rifles as they conducted covering fire prior to bounding towards another leveled building on the very edge of the installation, near to the perimeter fencing, yelling and shooting with sporadic blasts, the surging concussive waves of shells from tanks and 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter cannons on infantry fighting vehicles, blasting throughout the area. A steady ear-ringing occurrence. The Chi-Com forces in the area, though conducting mop-up operations to clear the area of all enemy forces to secure the installation, were largely pulling out to press assaults on other areas in the region, planning on leaving the remaining battalions in the area to occupy and hold positions as potential reserve forces for when the anticipated colossal struggle for the city would commence. U5, go first! Over the fence! We will cover you! Next, U5! Then we go! Stated a second lieutenant, the only officer in the particular group of 15 men, and its most senior ranking man, the rest of all being enlisted, both junior enlisted and non-commissioned officers alike. Sergeant Richardson nodded with the rest in understanding. This, as the rumbles of heavy vehicle engines and squeaking of tracks could now be heard, accompanying all the yelling, shooting, and blasts scattered and interspaced about. Came the splashing of 5.8 by 42 millimeter rounds, smacking into the ground, rubble, and two of the men in the group, both smacked in their helmets, by which the rounds passed clean through into their heads. Even as they had crouched fairly low behind one of the many former buildings that had been leveled in the opening barrage. "They're gone! We gotta go now!" yelled the second lieutenant at the top of his lungs over the noise of the group responding by largely shooting over the top of the heap of ruins, while two of the men checked the bodies to see if it were even possible to save them. This all had occurred in a matter of a few seconds, all erupting in an instant. "Covering fire!" yelled one of the men in one of the three groups of 5, now reduced to 4. Having all the rest respond in kind. China, the most powerful nation the world had ever seen or known to this point, had reduced their installation and forces in the area to complete shambles. Now, seconds later, the second group of men began to climb the fence, now cut down by machine gun and rifle fire, as they made a break for it. Richardson shot 2 rounds as he tensed up, trying to work up the nerve to climb the fence, as he seen the corpses littering both sides, from the men who made the attempt and completely failed and were thus cut down in the fire. The others who did make it were now in the prone position, making an attempt to fire through the chain-link fencing. Of course, aiming for Chi-Com infantry forces, now advancing against their positions. "Go, damn it! Climb!" yelled the second lieutenant from on the other side of the fencing. Richardson was already injured from having had been in a pancaking building earlier, being knocked unconscious from all the falling debris from it, though he had his helmet on and protective equipment. Now he had to risk being cut down by the projectiles now filling the air, as this specific area was thick with them, a wall of lead, truly. Came the clanking sound of several of the men's feet scaling the perimeter of the fencing. Came the gasp of agony as one of the men's legs caught several rounds, causing him to fall backwards as four others made it to safety. The man laid there on his back, it now being too late as the Chi-Com APCs approached, along with their dismounted infantry forces in tow. By now, no further than 50 yards away, enclosing upon the rubble pile that was a building before, and the chain-link fencing, came the noise of a grenade bouncing once after hitting some of the rubble. "Grenade!" yelled a few of the men in unison, laying flat as they already were in the prone position from shooting on the other side of the fencing from where the enemy forces had been approaching. Came a deafening blast wave and surge of noise along with it, as the grenade detonated, and up went a surge of smoke and debris. "Go! Now! Head for the ravine!" screamed the second lieutenant, as the men used the blast with all its debris, cloud of smoke, which undoubtedly KIA'd the already wounded man who fell from climbing earlier, having had been hit in the legs, using it to mask their next bound to better cover down in the ravine. The men bolted into the woods amid a torrent of shooting, no doubt at them. That, of course, wasn't to say that there couldn't have been others being targeted, but after they'd been losing some in the attempt to flee, that it likely was the Chi-Com pursuit forces trying to close the deal on them and complete their mission in the area, their mop-up operation. Just then came another blast. This time, a rocket projectile had flown past them and detonated upon impact a ways in front of them. Most likely a Type 69 Chi-Com RPG. Then another, bigger blast. An HJ-08 missile, a Heilianjiang missile, anti-tank missile, had been deployed, though fortunately they were safe in the ravine upon it impacting above the top of the ditch, completely shredding trees to pieces, throwing deadly, splintering pieces of wood in all directions, along with the already perilous shrapnel pieces. The men all kept as low as they could, with a staff sergeant, one of the men in the group of survivors, advising the second lieutenant on evasion tactics to exfiltrate from the area. The second lieutenant heeded the suggestions to follow the ravine seeing as there were no realistically feasible other options currently available. They all departed running while crouched low and crawling when and where necessary in the ravine. Rounds of different sizes zinged overhead, along with ordnances of various types blasting about, which all were now being utilized in an attempt to conduct area denial strikes to create a kill box, if possible, by which to eliminate the stragglers who had fled the post by now being pursued, now being pursued by a Chi-Com platoon of mechanized infantry forces who had smashed through the chain link fence with their armored personnel carriers upon having had reached the perimeter finally, which was the time the men had made it into the ravine. Fortunately for them, they hadn't gone much further west. They hadn't gone much further west, or they'd have ran into the greater part of a Chi-Com armored battalion, itself prepping to storm the city to the south, the outer northernmost suburbs of D.C. itself. The ravine continued to wind and weave and like a snake through the woods, as if a natural sort of trench system. The men didn't know where enemy Chi-Com forces were, and having no way to acquire any sort of actionable intel, had little choice but to stay low and stay quiet, at least as much as was humanly possible by this point. It had only been, by now, a matter of minutes from the time they had readied to evacuate the post to them now meandering silently through the woods, following the creek bed of the ditch that they now were in. Part 8. It was 8 a.m., and the sun had just begun to rise on October the 4th. With Joseph watching intently through his optics, the NVG optics no longer being required to see through the monocle as such, but he wanted to be sure it was safe enough to approach before he decided to go ahead and do so. To hell with it, he said to himself, as he pondered whether or not to move in for a better glance at who exactly he had been watching now for a few hours. He knew his wife Sally might be worried, but he needed to ensure they'd be relatively secure, at least as much as was even possible by this point. Minutes passed as he low-crawled towards the large group of armed men. By the time he was within 150 meters of them, he decided to quickly utter the word "friendlies," so as not to startle them, causing himself to get his ass shot off by a potential bad reaction to his suddenly appearing. Upon saying it, weapons were raised by about what seemed to be an excess of several dozen men. Nearly all wore realtree or hunting attire or other sorts of camouflage fatigues, and were armed with a wide assortment of personal firearms, mostly hunting and what some could even be called sporting rifles, with a few with shotguns. and most having pistols as well as sidearms. Essentially, they all brought whatever they had to bear in such a situation. The group was very rough in overall appearance, likely all rattled and jolted from their sleep merely 8 hours earlier, like Joseph himself was as well, and having to bail in a relative hurry from wherever they'd all been living up till the beginning of the invasion. They lowered their weapons gradually upon seeing Joseph raise up slowly from the ground a short distance away from them, and approaching cautiously. All the men returned to talking to one another quietly. One of them received Joseph, greeting him cordially. "What are you doing out here? Where are you coming from?" the man asked Joseph. "Fled Butte last night. Barely made it out alive when they'd conducted their assault on it." "Looks like you all experienced similar, I take it?" Joseph responded before adding, "My wife is in our truck, back on the hunting trail," as he motioned with his free hand back towards the southeast from where he came. "We are planning on taking back Butte," the man said bluntly to Joseph. "We have only what we could carry, and we need supplies from town. Low food, water, and ammo for all of us. We gotta use whatever we have as wisely as possible. I mean, we could hunt food, but we don't really want them to know where we are if they hear the shooting. Bad enough, they got drones and total control of the skies. Fortunately, these pines negate some of that," stated the man as he gave an upward glance at the thick forested canopy. "Of course," Joseph stated with a nod, indicating his understanding of the situation. The men spoke on for minutes before others approached and introduced themselves, and all said their pieces as it pertained to the overall situation currently at hand. Before Joseph told them he had to check on his wife and to expect him to return. He came to that decision upon seeing camping tents set up further off in the woods, wherein he'd been told that there were families of the men, and that's where they had set up tents as a camp for those who couldn't or shouldn't have to concern themselves with any potential fighting. Upon returning to the truck, Sally was asleep. Joseph was irritated at this, recalling his days in the service. Even if it was a field training exercise, falling asleep on guard duty was a major problem. He angrily pounded on the hood, startling her from a deep sleep, just barely catching himself before he was about to yell over the whole situation. "Sally, you can't be serious. Right now?" he snapped with a tinge of irritation in his voice. He couldn't he couldn't conceal. He quickly regained his composure, not wanting to necessarily unload on her, but just to remind her of how very dire things were, saying, "I'm glad I'm not one of those Chi-Coms, or you'd be done. I couldn't help it, My body just shut down, she responded with tears in her eyes at the realization that he was 100% correct, but also at having had failed at being alert. She indeed couldn't help it, and lacked the same sort of self-discipline that Joseph embodied. Grab the camping gear. We have a short hike ahead of us, Joseph told her, as he opened the door to help her out. They grabbed their tent, sleeping bags, and go bags that had a few days' worth of food and some ammo and medical supplies, and each grabbed a 1-gallon jug of clean drinking water, ostensibly for themselves. They had slung their rifles, each had, over their shoulders, as they had to carry so many things. However, Joseph's Glock 22, his 40 cal, was still easily accessible on his belt holster. And he was fairly capable, he was a fairly capable, quick draw type of man. They proceeded down into the woods, where this time the others expected his return, with Sally in tow with him. Meanwhile, skirmishes now raged in Stephenville, Hamilton, and Derby to the west, along Route 93, as 10 battalions belonging to the 4th Militia Corps, a unit of China's paramilitary National Guard-like forces, had moved down to secure this region of the Montana-Idaho state line area, all up and down this vital logistical route. Bill had since joined others on ATVs to scout the areas to the direct west of Derby, in the foothills, having had moved down from his lofty perch higher up in the mountains. They stayed off of the few paved and windy mountain roads in the area, and stuck to beaten paths of dirt or other hunting and or ATV trails that still maintained relatively adequate cover from the air from the canopy of the forested mountains. They'd stopped and glanced through binoculars at Derby, still well below their current positions, in a valley. They watched as big blasts eliminated a few buildings in the town through the binoculars. These buildings had been hit by an Su-34 ground attack aircraft, dropping a few what appeared to be 200-pound munitions. They could also see a long column of large trucks, of the covered variety, headed into the north end of the town on Route 93. These Shangji trucks, with their mounted paramilitary infantry troops, stopped shortly inside of town, where they could make out the tiny figures through the binoculars, emerging and shooting as they got out and formed into staggered column formations. Some of the trucks on Route 93 to the north of the town now peeled off the road itself to encircle Derby, maneuvering to all sides of the town. By this hour of the invasion, still relatively early into it, by 9 a.m. on day one, not all of the three aforementioned towns had fully cleared out and evacuated as of yet. Some simply because they refused to leave their homes, regardless of what occurred, opting instead to stay and fight the good fight. It was also surreal, watching from several miles away and at higher altitude, like watching a muted TV set, albeit with the echoes of the larger blasts whenever an air or artillery strike did happen to come in, which at this point were relatively isolated instances, which only occurred when the ground troops called them in onto a trouble spot. Everyone sat observing on their all-terrain vehicles, all sitting atop a cliff, but still beneath the tree line. They'll be fanning out and likely headed our way soon enough. Once they finish up down there, exclaimed one of the other men. Right. We should go warn everyone we can up in our mountain, responded Bill Glass, as he and the others agreed to hurry and try to relay the intel of what was going on with Derby to all those where they'd just come from before setting out to collect all the info they could on the current goings-on in their immediate vicinity.